Good morning. This is Doc with Dr. Patrick Live, and we're going to talk a little bit about cannabis. We're going to talk about Delta 8. There's a bunch of information. I'm going to be reading stuff because I want you to have some information. So the first off is this. If you go to my TikTok or on this YouTube, there's a lot of stuff about marijuana. And I'm not pro or con, for or against marijuana. I'm just a big believer that whatever we do, we need to be responsible. So there's a really good book if you just want to gain an overall understanding, and it's actually written from the pro side. It's a book called Smoke Screen by Dr. Sabat, S-A-B-E-T. And it's really a good book because it kind of helps you understand the history and why it's being used. Because the number one problem right now is we have many people using cannabis who really shouldn't be using it. Now, in some cases, it's very beneficial, but in a lot of cases, it isn't. And so we need to be aware. And in the midst of all this debate, right, this Delta 8 kind of crept in. And Delta 8 is like a lesser version of the THC cannabis that we typically think of as marijuana, which is Delta 9. So Delta 8 has a lot of those strong tendencies, but just not as strong. But it's equally, it changes your brain the same way. So you have to understand, Delta 8 THC can cause effects similar to Delta 9 THC. They're just going to be less potent. So that's the first thing you need to understand. The second thing is, even though the Farm Act in 2020 sort of allowed Delta 8, states are quickly catching on. It's becoming more and more illegal. So in most states, Delta 8 is illegal, although there still are some that allow it if you can find it. And so you just need to be aware about that. THC, right, has many powerful qualities. Now, if you go back into the early 80s, the level of THC in the typical marijuana joint was like 3%, right? Very low. Nowadays, it can be like 33%, and you can do stuff with dabs and everything that creates a highly concentrated level that can reach, according to some experts, 99%. As a result, there are some people overdosing on THC, which is something we never thought possible. But if you have enough of it in your system, it just kind of suppresses everything and you just kind of stop breathing. You really see it when people use edibles, because when they use edibles, it takes a while for the effect to kick in and they might have used too much. So if a person has anxiety or paranoia, a lot of times they'll use THC and they'll say, wow, it really helps. But really, THC only helps temporarily. It usually makes your anxiety and paranoia much worse, especially if you have that schizophrenic gene that kind of runs in you, which everybody has, but then it gets activated, because then the paranoia goes crazy and you get cannabis-induced psychosis. And when that happens, it's not good on any level. Let's just say that. So if you have specific questions, put them in the comments below and we'll try to address them. But we really want people to understand that the pros and the cons, right? Industry itself, right? If you talk to the cigarette growers back in the 60s and the 70s, right? They were talking about how powerful it was and it was great for you. No one wanted to admit that it was dangerous. Same for alcohol back in the 20s. Just because it's a substance, right? Cannabis doesn't make it good or bad. Alcohol, it's not good or bad. It's how it's used that makes the most difference, and how much of it is used. So when you think of it, because we'll have people that are adamant marijuana users, right? They're just all gung-ho about cannabis and they base it on their experience or their friends, and that's okay, but that's not research, and that doesn't apply to all people. We'll also have people that have bad experiences, and it doesn't mean that every bad experience applies to every person, but you have to be aware that it applies to a lot of people. So there's a lot of research that's out there. Even leafly.com has a bunch of interesting stuff, and that's a pro-cannabis site. Science Direct has a lot of topics that you can look up, different research categories. And so if you look on sciencedirect.com and you look up pharmacology, toxology, you'll learn all kinds of stuff about THC and what it's doing. And that's important, because whatever you decide to do, you should be informed. So cannabis does have a measurable effect on psychomotor performance and tracking ability. As we all know, if you use cannabis for about 4 hours, you are impaired. If you're driving, you're going to be messed up, and it can be in your system for a good 24 hours. So if you use it, you cannot drive because you are going to be under the influence. And even though it peaks at about 25 minutes, it's still in your system for 1 hour strongly, 4 hours, for the norm. So remember that. It's not just like, hey, I use it and then it's out of my system. No, it is what it is. So if you read through, there's all kinds of interesting things. It talks about how it affects growth hormones, in the pharmacology and the toxicology. There's roles of cannabinoids in pain management by Dr. Mark Wallace. As you know, the cannabis plant contains over 400 chemical compounds. And you know that clinically it's reported to reduce seizures. So that's a big use of it. It helps with muscle spasms. It can reduce inflammation. But the side effects are it can really mess you up. There's all kinds of research about Alzheimer's, right? Some people say, oh, it will help your memory. It'll help that part of your brain that works with Alzheimer's. But the research says different. The research says that cannabis affects your memory and it affects your brain, especially in the area that you really want to focus. And so as you get older, that area of your brain's not retaining information, right? The gray matter, which is kind of like the database of your brain, that information is, you're having difficulty recalling it. There's a direct link to cannabis. And so a lot of people do further research and link that to Alzheimer's. So you just have to be aware. It doesn't mean you will get it. It just means, why would you want to do something that puts you more on that track? And it doesn't mean it's the most dangerous chemical or it's the least dangerous chemical. It just means you have to be aware. This is about awareness. Don't let anybody put something in your body unless you know what it's doing. And don't just listen to people, nilly-willy, whatever, because they say it had a good experience or they had a bad experience. Know the research, understand. A lot of us are learning how to be healthier, right? Whether it's how much sugar we eat or not eat, how much we should exercise, how much we should sleep, how much water we should put into our bodies. There's a lot about the body we need to understand. And the brain is so complex. Please do some research. Start to understand why it is so popular, because let's face it, cannabis is the most widely used illicit substance in the United States. And the number one area it's growing is 16 to 24-year-olds. And we know it affects the prefrontal cortex and the growth there, which finalizes by age 25. So it's going to always affect your impulse control. It's going to affect your ability to concentrate. That's just going to happen because that part of the brain is still not fully developed. So you have to understand there are issues with it. In the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, cannabis users have noticed deficiencies of blood flow in that frontal part of the brain. And that's where they start to link the cannabis use to Alzheimer's. So you can go to the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease to read about it. And, you can agree or not agree. That's okay. Finally, remember, a lot of people who use cannabis get immediate short-term alleviation of symptoms. But once the cannabis leaves, whatever the symptomology is, usually gets worse. It doesn't solve it. It just sort of pushes it off and it kind of builds in its intensity. So understand that the short-term use may or may not be worth it. So when it comes to cannabis, when it comes to Delta 8, be very careful because everything you put into your body is going to affect your brain. So please be aware of how it does it. Don't just go and get a medical marijuana card if you can, because the doctors will just give it to anybody. And that seems to be the way it is. You just go in there and say, look, I have an issue. Oh, here it is. It's the answer. But remember, the reason they're doing it is they get paid, right? The industry as a whole is not concerned about individuals. It's a big money market. Start to read who's making money off it, and you start to see what's happening. Because it's the cigarette companies, it's the big alcohol companies, it's the big wealthy individuals who are buying into this and trying to get you to use it because they make money. It's the same thing with opioids, same thing with cigarettes before. There is a reason they want us as guinea pigs. It's all about the money. So take it all, evaluate it how you want, use this talk as a grain of salt, whatever, but be aware. Doc out.